Anything can happen in the next 60 minutes.
You're listening to the New Digital Frontier podcast.
Hello there, and welcome to this podcast, which is about the Great Pyramid Hoax. And with us today is Scottish researcher and author Scott Creighton. Hello, Scott.
Hi there.
Thanks for joining us today, Scott. I described you as an author and researcher, but you've been called a lot worse in your time, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely, George, absolutely.
You are the scourge of the orthodoxy when it comes to Egypt, aren't you?
Well, you name it, I've been called it.
You certainly have. The reason we're talking today, Scott, is you recently published a new book, The Great Pyramid Hoax 2. Now, you've written 5 books altogether, one with another author, Gary Osborne, but the other 4 by yourself. And the last 2 have been about a specific subject, which is the Great Pyramid Hoax. Following the publication of that last book, you were invited to put a video on Graham Hancock's website. Now, Graham Hancock is one of the world's best-selling authors on subjects like this, and the video itself got
250,000
views, just under, as we speak. It's about 40 minutes long. It's quite a documentary.
Yeah, but the good thing about it is one of the things that Graham does, George, is he doesn't allow adverts on his YouTube videos. So there's no adverts in it, folks. It's just 42 minutes.
And we have to say, Graham's absolutely amazing. I think you know him.
Yeah, I've met Graham a few times.
He's written a foreword for one of your books.
Yeah.
The weird thing is, he left the comments open in the video, and the criticism you get and the abuse you get is all personal.
Yeah.
There's very few people will come back and say, you're wrong about this bit's wrong. They called him Groundskeeper Willie from The Simpsons. I think the best compliment you got, you sounded like Neil Oliver, the Scottish historian.
I think one of them as well was, I'm listening to this and it sounds like Shrek reading a history book.
The other thing is, you used a bit of AI, which...
it was purely for illustrative purposes, because there's nothing worse than listening to somebody talking and you can't kind of see what they're talking about. But how do you see Colonel Vyse arriving in Alexandria? I'm not an artist. I don't have a great big production budget.
No.
So I use AI, which is the only thing I can use to make it reasonably interesting.
The last few months, everyone's been calling all AI slop. So I think that
has become a new meme, hasn't it?
But they accused you of having an AI voice, which...
well, some
you either have a Scottish voice or you've got an AI voice.
Well, after a few pints in the pub...
that's it. And, so watch the video after this podcast, and I think you'll be amazed.
George, this Great Pyramid Hoax 2, this, I suppose, is a culmination, if I could call it that, of basically my last 20 years research. This is a culmination point. It basically brings together in one book all my ideas, and finally I think I've put together a book which explains everything I understand that these monuments were all about. So it's all together in the one book, and it answers essentially my questions that I've had for many, many years, decades in fact, as to the true purpose of these ancient monuments. I started off, 20 odd years ago, writing and exploring this topic, and I started noticing certain things, and not just me that noticed these things, other researchers have noticed them as well. And it's questions that just baffle us. Like, for example, why did so many pharaohs build multiple giant pyramids? Why did the pyramids suddenly just appear almost out of nowhere?
Yes.
Why have we found pharaohs from later dynasties? We've found dozens and dozens of pharaohs from later dynasties, kings, queens, princes from ancient Egypt, but nothing from the early Old Kingdom period, from when these pyramids were being built. We found nothing. There's not a single king buried that was buried that has ever been found from that period. You know, there are so many questions. What this famous, it's called the Giza Diagonal. What is its real purpose? So there's all these questions. The sarcophagi, Egyptologists say, well, the pyramids have sarcophagi inside them, these granite boxes. Sometimes they're made of basalt. But in the Old Kingdom, these giant, I'm talking about the giant pyramids, only a couple of these, 3 of these monuments at Giza had sarcophagi, or what Egyptologists call sarcophagi. Now, the ancient Egyptians had 4 different words for a stone box. Were they all sarcophagi? You know, when you look at these stone boxes, they've never found any body in them. In fact, what they have found in them is earth and some bones in one of them.
Yeah, I think that would interest a lot of people, because I would say a lot of people listening might actually believe that the pyramids were broken into and people found bodies in them, mummies, treasures, stuff like that. But the pyramids at Giza have been basically empty. In terms of our history. They're not like the tombs in the valleys of the kings where people have broken into them. And you've written extensively about Giza and about the pyramids there. This one subject, though, you've been sort of pulled into, where you had to deal with, which is the Great Pyramid at Giza and the markings within it that link it to those 4th dynasty pharaohs that you're talking about. And what you are saying basically in your books is this link to those pharaohs is a hoax. It was a hoax perpetrated by someone in the 19th century called Colonel Howard Vyse.
Yeah. Egyptology, mainstream Orthodox Egyptology, regard these painted markings inside the Great Pyramid, these hidden chambers, or formerly hidden chambers within the Great Pyramid, that were discovered in 1837 by a British Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse. Now, he supposedly blasted, using gunpowder, his way into these sealed hidden chambers. I mean, there was no way into these chambers. They were built of limestone blocks and granite blocks. There was no way into them.
These chambers are above what people now call the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
They were actually relieving chambers, a kind of architectural, engineering, structural solution to try to disperse the weight of the Great Pyramid over this chamber. And they were sealed off. Although the Great Pyramid had been entered by people back in Roman times, people had been entering the Great Pyramid. This part of it had been sealed off because it wasn't part of the, as people thought, the tomb or whatever. It was a structural space above
the King's Chamber.
King's Chamber.
Yeah.
And this Colonel Vyse blasted his way into it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Egyptology, Orthodox Egyptology, say that these chambers above the King's Chamber, that Colonel Vyse discovered, that these are relieving or stress relieving chambers to disperse the weight of the monument above. But you know, the Queen's Chamber is much further down inside the Great Pyramid, and it doesn't have any of these stress relieving chambers above it. And there's a lot more weight above the Queen's Chamber because it's much further down within the monument, so there's more masonry above it, and there's no stress relieving chambers there. So are these chambers above the King's Chamber really for that purpose, or was there something else? It doesn't make sense that they wouldn't also have built stress relieving chambers above the Queen's Chamber, because some Orthodox Egyptologists insist that the Queen's Chamber was the original burial chamber for the Pharaoh Khufu, but he changed his mind and decided on a chamber much further up in the body of the monument. But then there's much less masonry much further up, pressing down on the King's Chamber than there is in the Queen's Chamber. So why would they suddenly decide that a chamber further up needed these stress relieving chambers, but the chamber further down didn't? It doesn't make any sense.
When this Colonel Vyse went to Egypt, what was he looking for? What was he trying to achieve? It was an age where a lot of Europeans, particularly aristocratic Europeans, would go to sites of the ancient world and simply try to make their mark, simply try to discover things, simply try to make their name. So when this Colonel Vyse went to Egypt, what was he trying to achieve? The pyramid was fairly well known. People knew it as the Pyramid of Khufu, often called the Pyramid of Cheops. What was he trying to prove? Was he trying to get a link between the pyramid itself and the Pharaoh Khufu?
A little bit of backstory. Vyse actually arrived in Egypt in late, I think, December 1835. He basically was a European that wanted to visit, Egypt and the Holy Land, which a lot of wealthy Europeans tended to do, as you pointed out at that time. And so he went off and did that, and then I think about late 1836, after a year's travel in Lower Egypt and the Holy Land or wherever, he returned to Egypt, arrived in Alexandria in late 1836, and then eventually ended up at Giza. Now, the circumstances for him investigating the Great Pyramid were kind of fortuitous for Vyse, and he was there at a time when there was another explorer there, a chap called Giovanni Caviglia, and he ended up working with Giovanni Caviglia, exploring inside the Great Pyramid. Now, he was hoping, essentially Vyse was ultimately, his goal, and he says this in his published book, was to discover the true burial place of the Pharaoh Khufu. That was his goal, plainly stated. He wanted to find that. I suppose, in a sense, at that time, in 1837, in Egypt you had, German research teams, you had Italian research teams, French. It was a free-for-all. It was like the Wild West in a sense.
Yes.
Everybody was trying to make big discoveries, it was a bit...
Make their mark. Gentlemen of means who would go out and try to make a name for themselves.
Yeah, but it was more than that, George. It was about national prestige as well.
Yes.
For making the biggest, most important discovery for your country, for old Blighty,
For the British Empire.
For the British Empire, so there was all that sort of sub-narrative going on as well. So yeah, Vyse wanted to make an important discovery. He actually says this in his book. He writes, that he wanted to make an important discovery before returning home to England, and that he would use whatever time and money it took in order to do that. He actually says that in his published book.
Yes, that appears in your video. It's a quote that appears at the start of your video. It's very telling that he went there to achieve a particular goal, and it's almost as if he was determined to achieve that goal. Yeah. Now, what people might not realise is the Great Pyramid had almost no writing on it, no hieroglyphs, nothing that would identify it or connect it to the Pharaoh Khufu, until Vyse managed to go on. Tell us what he did.
Yeah, okay. Well, actually, George, there were no pyramids up to that point that had ever been found with any writing inside them whatsoever. None of them, and we're talking about all the pyramids before the Great Pyramid. It's only really, I think, from the 6th dynasty, the late 5th, early 6th dynasty, that official writings started to appear inside pyramids. But not at that time, not inside the Great Pyramid or any of its precursors. So, Colonel Vyse's discovery, now the writing that Colonel Vyse, just to be clear to your listeners, the writings that Colonel Vyse discovered weren't official writing. They weren't, engravings, hieroglyphic engravings sculpted into the walls. This was basically essentially graffiti in a sense, not strict graffiti, but graffiti in a sense. It was just crudely painted onto the walls of these chambers that he discovered.
This was above the king's chamber. This was the so-called relieving space that he blasted his way into. Yeah. So he was the first person really in there since the construction of the pyramids. And lo and behold, he finds what?
He finds all these painted markings. They were painted onto the walls and the upper chamber, the ceiling blocks in these the leaving chambers with red ochre paint, just crudely painted markings on these walls, hieroglyphic signs that were painted on these walls. The strange, one of the peculiar things or standout questions from Vyse's discovery is that there are 5 relieving chambers above the king's chamber. There's not just the one chamber, there's 5 of these little chambers above the king's chamber, one above the other. The very first one was discovered by a guy called Nathaniel Davison in 1765, I believe it was. Yeah. And that chamber had always been open from antiquity. It's the first chamber above the king's chamber, first relieving chamber, and it had always been open for as long as anyone could remember. It doesn't look as if it was ever sealed.
And was there writing in that one?
No, that's a strange thing. All the similar chambers that are above Davison's chamber, you've got Wellington's chamber, Nelson's chamber, Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, and finally Campbell's chamber. These are all situated above Davison's chamber. Davison's chamber had no hieroglyphics whatsoever that were found whatsoever, but all the others did have hieroglyphics found inside them, or hieroglyphs.
The marks that Vyse found apparently were made in the quarry as the stones were being quarried. They were workers who would make their own personal marks or graffiti, and somehow these marks survived all the construction of the pyramid, all the travelling, all the dragging about, whatever methods they used to build the pyramids. They survived and were placed in situ and were never seen again until Vyse broke into the chamber.
Well, yeah, that's the orthodox theory. Yeah.
And these marks are really the only thing that link the Great Pyramid to Khufu.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. In the highest of these relieving chambers, which Vyse called Campbell's chamber, a cartouche, which is the pharaoh's name, was found bearing the name Khufu. There were other, an ancient Egyptian pharaoh at that time had up to 5 different names, and there was 3 of those names of Khufu in these chambers. Different chambers had, one of his names is Horus Mededu. You would find that in Lady Arbuthnot's chamber. In Campbell's chamber you had Khufu, and I think there's also a Horus Mededu in there, and Khnum Khufu is in Lady Arbuthnot's and also in Nelson's chamber and Wellington's chamber. So you have various different names of Khufu throughout the 4 chambers that Colonel Vyse discovered.
That seems strange that only he discovered them when he broke into these previously sealed chambers, and it was almost exactly what he was looking for.
Well, he didn't find. He wanted to find Khufu, the original true burial place of Khufu, because it was never found. The King's Chamber, as said at the top of the talk, was found empty. There was no body inside the granite sarcophagus.
Now, visitors to the Great Pyramid will recognise what you're talking about. You go in through a kind of makeshift hole in the side and enter the Great Gallery. You make your way up into the so-called King's Chamber. And there's a funny kind of stone sarcophagus there, if you want to call it sarcophagus, but it's basically a stone block that doesn't look fit for a pharaoh. And you lay in it once. I've seen a Daily Record up here in Scotland. We've got a newspaper called the Daily Record, and there was a photo of you lying in it. You probably weren't supposed to do that, were you?
No, but it was worth it. I felt the power.
Was it big enough?
Oh, absolutely. There was probably. I'm 5'10", so there was probably.
He's lying, ladies and gentlemen. He's about 5'8".
6'9". No, there was probably about a foot. Spare for me to lie in it. So it was very roomy.
But this is supposed to be the chamber of the pharaoh, the king. And up above it, you have these relieving chambers. And this Great Pyramid, it's the last surviving 7 wonders of the world. The dimensions of it, the size of it, the engineering that must have taken to build is absolutely amazing. And yet, there's no real authenticated marks on it that tell us what it is. The casing stones outside, they're polished white granite casing stones, are long gone.
Limestone.
Were there ancient tales of writing on them that might have enlightened us, but there was nothing in this structure that linked it to anybody until Vyse broke in and found all these marks on it that apparently survived their way from the quarry. And this little detail, or these little details, are what we pin the whole dating of the pyramids on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have Vyse breaking into this chamber and finding these marks. And as far as Egyptology and orthodoxy is concerned, that's it. That's the link we have between the Great Pyramid and the Pharaoh Khufu, who supposedly built it. And we're talking about 2,500 BC. That makes it 4,500 years old. That means that when Cleopatra was on the throne of Egypt, the Great Pyramid was already 24, 25 centuries old.
Yeah, Cleopatra's nearer to our time.
Nearer to us than
the Great Pyramid.
Yes, And yet these faint marks are the only real clue we have to who built it and why. That if it's a tomb, it was built for the Pharaoh Khufu. So Vyse manages to. How did he get into these? He used blasting powder back in the 18...
Yeah, black powder, gunpowder.
Black powder.
Yeah.
And I remember not long ago there was a huge controversy. Was it a couple of German students or a couple of German researchers nicked a little bit out of the chamber to test it?
Yeah, they took some paint. All over the media it said they stole the Khufu cartouche, which was just absolute nonsense. They took a fragment of paint
from the wall.
But not from the Khufu cartouche, the famous Khufu cartouche. It was from a side piece of hieroglyphic writing in another part of the chamber. They didn't touch the Khufu cartouche at all, but they did take a sample from another hieroglyph and had it tested, because the thing is, you cannot test ochre paint because it's iron oxide. So
there's no kind of there's no carbon dating that you can do with it.
Well, yeah, you can, because what happened, what the ancient Egyptians did, if you just mix iron oxide with water and mix it up and paint it onto a wall, it would just run everywhere.
Right.
So what they did was they would put a binder agent in the mix, like eggs or oil, fish oil or honey, to act as a binding agent for the paint, so it would bind better to the wall. So that's what they would do. So those are organic material,
Yeah.
which can be carbon dated. So that was the idea that these German...
But I remember at the time there was outrage about it, and you can understand that, it's an ancient monument, but compared to what Vyse did, he just blew his way into this chamber.
Well, that was...
He just blew his way into this chamber because he felt it was his God-given right just to do this and to put a stamp on things. Wasn't there a Prussian guy around in Egypt at that time that more or less said, I know what this guy's up to. He's determined to find this evidence linking it to Khufu.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's Hermann von Puckler-Muskau, who was a Prussian prince. He actually met Colonel Vyse at Giza when Vyse was there exploring the pyramids. But interestingly, Vyse writes in his book about this guy, this Prussian prince, and Vyse hadn't broken in to any of the chambers yet. The first chamber Vyse broke into was Wellington's, and this was in sort of late February that he met Puckler-Muskau, and he hadn't broken into Wellington's chamber yet. That didn't happen until March. But the strange thing is, Puckler-Muskau said to Colonel Vyse that he would find an inscription inside the chamber, which
he would find. He predicted
it. Yeah, but the strange thing is, Puckler-Muskau in his own books says that he believes that the ancient monuments, not the later pyramids, but the ancient ones like the pyramids at Giza, were built without any writing in them.
Yes,
So he has said that in his own book, that he believed that these ancient primeval monuments were built without any writing, but yet he said to Colonel Vyse when at Giza that he would find an inscription inside the monument. And then later in his published book, I think between 1845 and 1847, he basically accused Colonel Vyse of pretending to have found these markings.
When he said he's going to find something, he meant he's determined to find it and he's going to make sure he's going to find it.
Yeah. He's basically...
he's come over here for this and he will do it.
One way or another.
One way or another, by hook or by crook. And this comes down to it. Now, you've written 5 books in total. 2 of them are about this Great Pyramid hoax. You've got your own theories about the pyramids, but this is a separate issue. You accuse Colonel Vyse of fraud, and you're not the first one. This is not the first time this theory has been proposed, that the marks in these chambers were faked. Who did it first?
Right, well, just to pick up on a small correction what you said there, George. Technically, I'm not accusing Colonel Vyse of perpetrating a fraud. What I'm doing is I am gathering evidence.
Yes.
Because Colonel Vyse was accused of fraud on 2 occasions. First by Puckler-Muskau, the Prussian prince,
yes,
and then in the 1980s by another writer, international best-selling author, Zechariah Sitchin. He also did his own research and accused Colonel Vyse of perpetrating a fraud. So I was basically investigating that because Sitchin, in one of his books, one of his later books, he presented evidence from an American chap, a guy named Walter Allen, who lived in Pittsburgh,
yes,
Pennsylvania. And apparently this guy's great-grandfather worked with Colonel Vyse at Giza at the time. And according to this Walter Allen, who wrote this logbook, because he was interested in researching his family's genealogy, and he found out that he had a great-grandfather that worked in Egypt in 1837 with Colonel Vyse. And these letters were passed down through the family, and it eventually came to Walter Allen's attention, and he wrote it down, the family history, in his own sort of notebooks. And one of the things that he was told was that his great-grandfather, a chap named Humphreys Brewer, worked with Vyse at Giza and had witnessed forgery
Yes.
taking place. So that really was my starting point. What is the truth to these witness statements, to these allegations?
The trouble is, this guy, Sitchin,
Yeah, Zechariah
he
Sitchin.
haunts this subject
Yeah.
because he rushed in where angels fear to tread. And he made a bit of a mess of it, or
Yeah.
he also he's into aliens or
Yeah,
something like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And he despoiled this subject for a long time, didn't he?
Yeah,
And a lot of people wouldn't touch it. But also, Graham Hancock and Robert Vival touched upon this subject too, didn't they?
Yeah. Early on, when Graham and Robert were writing books together, they accepted Zechariah Sitchin's research. I have to say, naively accepted Zechariah Sitchin's research because he didn't do a very good job of it at all. I can't go into the details. It would be here for another 2 hours. But he made an absolute mess of it and was absolutely rightly discredited for it. And
But it doesn't mean he was wrong.
well, it doesn't mean he was wrong, but the way he went about it was completely wrong.
And since then, whenever this subject's raised, immediately Sitchin. This has been done and disproven. It's been debunked. Now, since then, as I say, you've got your own theories about the pyramid, but this thing stands alone. This Vyse issue stands alone. And I think since probably you started researching it and writing your books, there is no one else who has looked at this subject in such detail and come up with the same conclusion that basically there was a hoax, there was a fraud here, that Vyse got into this chamber and painted on the walls exactly what he wanted to be discovered.
Yeah. What your listeners have to understand is it was so important to find Khufu's name. If he couldn't find his body, he would at least find the name. In failing to do that, having spent so much money, Vyse spent in today's term $1.2 million.
This cost a huge amount of money.
And he's not finding anything.
To get to Egypt, put teams together to even survive there in those days.
What would he have thought? Well, let's give history a helping hand.
Yeah, exactly.
I believe he actually genuinely did discover genuine markings, hieroglyph markings, ancient hieroglyph painted markings. I believe he genuinely did discover these, but they weren't discovered in an interesting place, if I could put it like that, or a place that would be definitive in some way. I believe Colonel Vyse discovered these painted markings not inside these chambers. He found them outside in the pyramid. There was these rubble piles outside the Great Pyramid.
Yes, and there'll be a link to your video in the description below, which details this exactly. That here was a man who had some knowledge, some bits of knowledge.
Yeah, he knew Khufu. He knew how to spell the name Khufu. He knew the hieroglyphics for the name Khufu. He absolutely did.
And he then used that. He projected it.
Well, he could see it in these rubble piles. All these painted hieroglyphs on stones on the rubble piles outside the pyramid. He actually states this in his book. He was constantly finding stones on the outside of the pyramid with red painted hieroglyphics on them.
Yes.
So it doesn't take a great stretch of the imagination to figure out that, well, if you could just transplant them to within the pyramid, sealed chambers, then they become much more important. They become much more important because he can then claim, well, I found these markings in hidden chambers. So that effectively then can date the monument. Whereas finding them in blocks and rubble piles outside the pyramid, they could have been written onto the stones outside, before they fell off the pyramids, long after the construction of the pyramid. So they do not then definitively date the monument. They only can date the monument if they're found in a sealed chamber deep inside the monument. So that's essentially what I think happened. And I don't say that lightly. I say it because there's a lot of evidence that points to it.
Yes, and we'll come on to that now. You mentioned Vyse's book. He published a book about his so-called discoveries at Giza, but he also had another book, didn't he? A private book.
Yeah, these were his field notes that he basically wrote, his diary.
You've seen it, haven't you?
Yeah, about, I think it was probably 2012, 2013, something like that. So about 13, 14 years ago, I did some research, and because in his actual book, he actually writes that his published book is based on his field notes.
Yes.
He actually says that at the beginning of the book. So that tells you right away that the field notes exist. And I knew that field notes existed, so I just had to find out where they were, and no one was telling me. So I had to find it for myself. I eventually managed to track his field notes down to a small archive centre in Buckinghamshire.
Yes. You weren't allowed to use these notes as part of your video or in your recent books, were you?
Well, just very quickly, there's some fairly damning or incriminating pages in his private notes, not in his published.
Yes,
book,
exactly.
For obvious
His
reasons.
private notes, he was talking to himself.
Yeah. His private journal, it was incriminating. I wanted to use it in the recent video that I did for Graham Hancock's YouTube channel. However, when I wrote to the copyright holders, they refused permission to use the pages. So the strange thing is, copyright law for books lasts 70 years after the author's dead.
Yes.
And Colonel Vyse died in, I think, 1865, so 70 years have long expired.
Yes.
But the problem with the journal, it's still under copyright.
Right.
Because it has never been published in its original native format.
Yes.
The actual handwritten pages has never been published. So any document like that, unpublished documents in the UK, are protected and copyright protected until 2039.
And you've studied the man, I think, and you've studied his own writings and his own thoughts and his own little sketches that were meant only for himself.
Yeah.
As he tried to figure out what he should put on these walls, if that's what he did. So you tell us, this man breaks into this chamber.
Mm-hmm.
He's got the means, he's got the motive, he's got the opportunity. What happens?
Right, so he breaks into the chambers. Let's take, for example, Lady Arbuthnot's chamber.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the third chamber that Colonel Vyse broke into. Now, this was on the 6th of May, 1837. He breaks into Lady Arbuthnot's chamber. Now, he wants to be the first in because he doesn't want anyone else, getting the accolades for any important discovery. He wants to be first in. So he enters the chamber once it's been breached with one of his assistants, a chap named Mr. Raven. And so they go in, and the story is, we can read this in his published book, they didn't find any markings.
They didn't find any markings when they first went in.
They didn't see anything on the walls. There's
Scott,
no report.
How big is this chamber?
It's about 16 feet wide by about 32 feet long by about 3.5 feet high.
About the size of someone's attic.
Yeah, a very low ceiling, yeah.
And they've got 19th century lamps, I take it.
Yeah, oil lamps, candles.
So they can see.
Well, I mean, they could see the markings supposedly on the walls of the chambers below. Remember, this was the third chamber. So supposedly from what Vyse writes in his book. They'd already discovered markings in Wellington's chamber and Nelson's chamber
Yes.
on the walls there. And then suddenly, in Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, they don't find any markings whatsoever. Now, they didn't see any markings upon the walls there whatsoever. But the strange thing is, today, with just a simple hand torch, you can see many of the markings.
You can see them, yes.
There's markings there.
Uh-huh.
And in Vyse's book, what he says in his book, this is 3 days later, on the 9th of May, is that he, or maybe the 10th of May, after a second, more in-depth examination of the chamber, they suddenly found markings 4 days later.
In that kind of space with a lamp, how much more in depth do you need when you first go in a place to see marks on a wall?
Yeah, well, think about it. They're already primed to search.
Well,
the walls.
You're going to be amazed. You go into this place, you're going to be amazed, and you're going to look at the walls. You just don't say.
Well, they were looking at the walls because he actually says in his published book that they were measuring the walls, and they actually say that the walls in this chamber weren't as well constructed as the walls in chambers below. So they were examining the walls.
So a cynic would say there was nothing on the walls when he first went in. Then a few days later,
they discover all these hieroglyphs. That's just so suspect. It's just so suspect because how could they not? They would have been primed to look closely at the walls
immediately
for markings
to see what was
because
there.
they'd found supposedly markings in the chamber walls below.
So they'd be expecting to see more of the same, and they would be looking to see more of the same.
And they didn't, and it's completely strange. But the strangest, it gets even stranger. They found these markings 3 days later, on the 9th. But the strange thing is when you look at the dedication inscription on the chamber wall, Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, because this is something Vyse did with all of these chambers.
They had a kind of official opening.
Yes, yeah, they had the opening date of the chamber, painted in huge letters on one of the chamber walls, dedicating them to Lord Nelson, Wellington, Lady Arbuthnot.
And he was painting this stuff on the wall.
On the wall of these chambers.
Well, at least he wasn't taking a little chip out.
So there you go. But the thing is, the date that he puts on for Lady Arbuthnot's chamber is the 9th of May. Mm-hmm. The chamber was opened on the 6th of May.
So there's 3 days.
Why?
What was going on?
But then he got his assistant, Mr. Hill, to copy the markings that were supposedly on the walls of Lady Arbuthnot's chamber. He made 6 1-to-1 facsimile drawings of the markings in this chamber. And on all these sheets, you can see them in the British Museum today. You have to make a booking to see them. That's by appointment. He writes on all of these sheets, 6 different sheets, Lady Arbuthnot's chamber opened on the 9th of May, 1837. And then suddenly you read his book and it says the chamber was opened on the 6th of May.
Yes.
Why suddenly does he go from the 9th to the 6th? Well, I think this is my own personal theory. I think, and this is something else that's really strange. I'll come back to what I think. Mr. Perring published his own book a year before Colonel Vyse. This is Vyse's discoveries. This is Vyse's major. But he helped Mr. Perring do this.
Yes.
Because I think Colonel Vyse wanted to see what date Mr. Perring was going to say when Lady Arbuthnot's chamber was opened. And it turns out Mr. Perring wrote in his own book that the chamber was opened on the 6th of May, which is the true opening date. It's actually in Vyse's own hand notes and in his book as well, because I think he had to roll back from the 9th back to the 6th because Perring wasn't budging, he wasn't going to change his mind.
This is all straightforward stuff.
There should be no
Why
stuff
would
like this.
anyone be messing about with dates or changing things or being cagey about when you first discovered something and when other people saw it? If Vyse did fraudulently paint these marks and try to make it look like they were original, he made the kind of stupid small mistakes that we all would make trying to do it. And in a lot of instances, he over-eggs the pudding, trying to make it look like, this is so much of what I was looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if people watch that video, read my books, they will see the mistakes that they made. They're just so blatant mistakes that they made in painting, copying these markings from outside the pyramid into the pyramid. They made mistakes in doing that simple
The big thing to remember is the marks were not supposed to have been done in situ in the chamber. They were supposed to have been done out in the quarry by workmen, and they made their way all the way up into the construction of the pyramid, and they were laid out where Vyse discovered them. But if you see them in situ, you know that they've been done where they are. Yeah,
they've been painted onto the wall in situ, where, they're upside down. I mean, if you're painting something on a wall in front of you, your name onto a wall in front of you, you wouldn't paint it upside down. But this is what we find in these chambers, and what Orthodox Egyptologists says is that, well, that proves they're genuine, because the marks were actually painted upright by the scribe at the quarry, but by the time they ended up in the pyramid, the stone had been turned 180 degrees.
That's exactly what Vyse would want you to believe, wouldn't it? It's almost intentional. It's almost intentional.
It's a clever ruse.
When you try to make a mess, it doesn't look the same as a genuine mess. There's something contrived about the way. And you show this so clearly in your books and in the video that people have to see it. Again, link in the description below. When you see it, and when you see the kind of thing that you would do to try to make something look like something, you would make these mistakes. You would just go overboard. It's so contrived.
Obviously, he wanted to make an important discovery. He tells us that. He absolutely tells us that. But I think there may have been another motive. I mean, I can't prove this, but it may have been something for Vyse. Vyse was a very religious man. I actually went down to his home in Stoke Poges in Buckinghamshire, and I even went along to his local church and sat in the pew that Colonel Vyse was reserved for the Vyse family, and sat there, and there's windows that are dedicated to some members of the Vyse family in this little church.
And you weren't struck by lightning?
Well, it was close thing, John. Yes. It was a close thing. But, he was a very religious man. Religion doesn't make you a perfect person, but he was a religious man, and I think possibly one of the motives was to ensure that the monuments were credited to a person, a known historical figure. Within the known historical time frame, and that these monuments could not have existed before the flood.
He probably thought, what harm does it do if I just put the cherry on the cake here with this, and it squares the circle for everybody. This is indeed Khufu's Great Pyramid. What harm does it do? And that's the big question. What harm does it do?
Well, he's transposing, in my opinion, these markings outside the monument into the monument. He's finding original, genuine, ancient hieroglyphs on these stones, albeit outside the monument. Is it such a big crime to just move them inside? He probably thought not. If anything, he probably thought, well, this is preserving. This is a way of preserving these inscriptions by copying them into the monument. But here's the thing: he tells us in his book that he was finding. For weeks and weeks, he was finding these painted markings on stones outside the monument, but there's no record of them. There's just one solitary reference in his published book to these markings. From Vyse's perspective, we know he wanted to make a really important discovery. He tells us that himself. this is the thing that gives him,
It's why we're talking about
immortality.
him now. Yes.
Yeah, we're talking about him today. He has become, he's gained immortality.
It's like Schliemann and Troy.
Yeah,
regardless of what damage he did, he's associated with it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you were the one that came along and finally pushed through, I think, through all the doubts about Sitchin and any doubts before that these marks are probably forged. They're probably fake. They were put there by Vyse for his own ends. I never questioned. I never forensically questioned at that.
They've never been scientifically...
Never scientifically. And that's...
analysed.
This is the one frustrating thing for anyone on the periphery of this kind of subject. They just think, well, why don't they do a thorough examination? There must be ways of testing this. There must be ways. There was blasting powder went into the chamber when it was first broken into. Surely that blasting powder would be on the surface of the walls underneath the ochre paint, if the ochre paint was put on after that point. And no one will test it, will they?
Well, I watched or read a report, watched a video recently. There's an expedition or a mission called Inside the Great Pyramid mission, and they have been forensically, this is 2025, they were in there just last year, they have been forensically photographing everything inside these chambers and analysing the markings. I actually think it's quite interesting that this is all happening now for some reason. But anyway, one of the things that this report talks about is whether it would be possible to scientifically date the painted markings. They know about the binding agents that we discussed earlier.
Yes.
They know about that, but they're saying that, well, the problem is with all the people visiting these chambers over last couple of 100 years, a lot of contamination in there now, so it probably no longer possible or viable to do any carbon
proper
testing,
analysis of
proper
them.
scientific analysis
And these are areas that a tourist would not get to, would they? You can't access these chambers.
Yeah.
They have been sort of preserved as well as possible.
But they are open. They are accessible. So yeah. But the strange thing as well, that on the one hand, that report's saying that it's probably not viable to do radiocarbon dating, C13, C14 dating on these painted markings. But a few years ago, they managed to find a piece of wood that had been found inside the Great Pyramid. I think it was 1850s, 1860s, something, by a chap called Wayman Dixon. And the piece of wood was placed in a tobacco tin, and for some reason it ended up being recorded, given to a museum in Britain, being recorded, and then somehow got lost. And it was only found again a few years ago, and they radiocarbon dated it. And the date, now this piece of wood was sealed inside the shaft of one of the shafts, the star shafts of the Queen's Chamber, which had been sealed since the monument was built.
Yes.
And this guy managed to find it by tapping the walls. He knew the star shafts in the King's Chamber above were open, so he thought to himself, maybe there's star shafts in the chamber below. So he starts tapping the wall, because you couldn't see any. Yes. Because they were sealed at the time. So he starts tapping the wall, and he comes to this part of the wall that when he taps it
sounded hollow.
Sounded hollow, or some kind of echo, or it sounded different. So he starts breaking it away, and he finds this piece of wood. He found a couple of other things as well, but he found this piece of wood and put it in this tobacco tin and send it to a museum. It gets lost, and as I said, get found and was radiocarbon dated a few years ago. And it came back with an estimated age for this piece of wood of about 3,500 to 4,000 BC, which is way older than the pyramid. But Egyptologists argue, well, the tree was old It's this thing they call the old wood problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I just say that there is nothing older than the photograph that Scott uses on the back of his books.
You're not actually kidding. No, actually, most of the books actually tend to use a younger picture. But anyway, so this. But here's the thing. This piece of they can date this piece of wood that's been in a tobacco tin of all things,
yes,
which would have been contaminated.
Yeah.
But they're happy to accept a contaminated date from that piece of wood, but not from the painted markings that have been contaminated. They won't test them.
This comes down to a central fact that your theory that this is a hoax terrifies orthodoxy because it opens a door.
Yeah.
It loses us the link between the Great Pyramid and Khufu, and it loses us that link in time in terms of dating also, that we're talking 2500 BC. If it's not linked to Khufu, and this is where Graham comes into, and this is where the whole idea of far more ancient civilizations existing on Earth come into play, that if they lose these marks made by Howard Vyse, if they lose these marks and the anchor that they have on the dating of the pyramids, then it opens the door to all sorts of things, which terrifies orthodoxy and the hostility and the dismissiveness that you've had all the time, particularly with this one subject, and Graham gets it too, Graham Hancock gets it too, is that they are losing what they hold as sacrosanct. That the dating of the pyramid is 2500 BC. It was built by the Pharaoh Khufu as a tomb. But many of us, myself included, believe that the pyramids are the Great Pyramid of Giza is far older than we think. And the one thing holding the dam back are these markings made by Vyse. If they were made by Vyse, if they were genuine, that's fine. But it needs a thorough examination, it needs a scientific examination.
Well, they don't want the narrative to change.
They don't want the narrative to change.
It's as simple as that.
And that's the weirdest thing. If someone's of an inquiring scientific mind, why wouldn't it excite you that the door is open to a new history of the pyramids? But people have to watch your video, and they should read both of your books. The first book, The Great Pyramid Hoax, covered, I think, your main argument, and then you covered an awful lot of extra stuff that's in the Great Pyramid Hoax too. Again, the links to both books are below the description here. Where do you think we go from here?
Well, as you said or pointed out there, George, we do somehow need to get a definitive answer on these painted markings. There's just too much evidence that points in the opposite direction to authenticity. There's just too much evidence, which I present in my videos and in the books. We need a definitive answer, because if we don't get a definitive answer, this question is just going to drag on, and it's just going to become a running open sore for Egyptology as well, because my argument isn't going to go away.
And if you want to see the Great Pyramid Hoax unpicked by Scott, read the books, watch the video, and you'll see exactly where he's coming from. This isn't just an assault on orthodoxy. This is picking apart a crime, a hoax, a piece of fraud by the mistakes of the man who made it.
Yeah, I mean, the point is, it's an investigation. That's what I'm doing, and that investigation, whether orthodoxy accepts it or not, is actually for their benefit as well as everybody else's.
You would think so. You'd think people would welcome the truth. Nothing that you say in your books leads on to a different conclusion. These marks are fraudulent, therefore my theory about the pyramids is right, or therefore the pyramids were built by aliens, or therefore the pyramids are
it's a standalone investigation,
Yes,
George. It's a standalone investigation. I think it did impact in certain ways our mindset today as to what these structures were built for, because I think if Colonel Vyse did perpetrate a hoax, it essentially set and train a motion that everything regarding the tomb, the pyramid of the tomb, became solidified.
Complacency.
Yeah. Well, the
established
became,
narrative.
Yeah, it became solidified, calcified by Colonel Vyse's discovery, because, here's Khufu's name, it must be Khufu's tomb.
Yes.
And that, has solidified the tomb of the pharaoh narrative ever since, which I think is to some degree wrong.
And I think, ladies and gentlemen, in the great sweep of history and science, we always need a doubting Thomas. I don't think there's a more cantankerous doubting Thomas than Scott Creighton.
That's my middle name.
Scott, thanks very much for this interview. That's been wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome, George.
George Henry was talking to Scottish author and researcher Scott Creighton. There are links to Scott's books, The Great Pyramid Hoax and The Great Pyramid Hoax 2, and to his video documentary on the Graham Hancock channel, in the description below. Thanks for listening, and please like and subscribe.